Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll just give people a couple more minutes to make their way, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Rose Jackson with Corporate Accountability and a member of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today, some friends, colleagues, and new faces, and also having people join in online. So thank you for taking the time. We know it's a rather busy couple of weeks. We're here today to talk about a very important issue, not just for climate justice or gender justice, but for climate action in general. As we know, the need for urgent, just, and rapid climate action is greater than ever. And yet, here in these halls, we're seeing many false solutions, dangerous distractions, and talk of things that revolve way too little action, way too late. We're watching governments negotiate the finalities of carbon markets, things that we know we don't have time for, that won't work at scale, and that can't realistically keep us on a pathway to keeping global temperature rise below 1.5. All of this is underscored, of course, by the latest science from the IPCC Working Group 2, which detailed what we're all now calling, after the UN Secretary General's comments, an atlas of human suffering that the world is facing, and particularly communities on the front lines and in the global south, if we do not radically rethink what the global response to climate change looks like here and now. Many communities, including those who are represented by the members of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, are already living and experiencing the reality of the climate crisis. And so today we're here to talk about a much needed alternative to the net zero by 2050 pathway, carbon offsets, carbon markets, and all of the other things that we're hearing much talk of here and in climate action debate in general. Instead, we're here to talk about a pathway to achieve real zero emissions on time to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis, and to take the only shot and the last shot we have to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees as agreed in the Paris Agreement. We have an amazing panel today, all of whom are members of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. We have Simone Lovera from the Global Forest Coalition, Claire Miranda from Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Gadir Lavadenz, the Global Coordinator for the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, and Kwami Kponzo from Friends of the Earth Togo and the Global Forest Coalition. As we all know, or I should say, today we're going to try to have more of an interactive style. We know we're all tired. It's nearing the end of week 1 of the climate talks, and the negotiations are getting a little wearing and frustrating at best. So instead of doing the traditional panel sort of side event, we're going to ask a variety of questions, hear from our panelists multiple times, and then also ensure that we have lots of time for you all to engage in conversation with us as well. But we're going to begin setting the scene, since today's theme is all about gaining a deeper and collective understanding of what Real Zero is and how we can deploy real solutions to achieve it. I want to ask you, friends, as we all know, the climate crisis is here and now, and if we have any chance of avoiding the worst effects of the climate crisis, we do need to rapidly deploy real solutions that will justly and urgently get us to Real Zero. So I'd like to start from hearing from all of you just a little bit about what do we actually mean when we say Real Zero. Claire, should we start with you?
Thanks, Rachel. So to answer the question, I think it's important that we go back to the science and the simple explanation of why we have the climate crisis right now. We know that climate change is the result of the excessive emissions of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere driven by the system of overproduction and overconsumption. And we also know that the simple way of solving this is actually to reduce the emissions from its source by ending fossil fuel extraction, shifting to renewable energy sources, transforming our industrialized agricultural system to sustainable agroecology. These are all the real solutions to the climate crisis. And it's as simple as basically stop polluting and bringing the existing emissions down to nearly zero by the end of 2030. It's pretty simple compared to the very complicated reductions or offsetting proposed by the net zero scheme, where there's no actual stopping of emissions done, but just canceling out the emissions through carbon capture technologies. And achieving Real Zero is as simple as stopping the pollution or no longer adding to more emissions to the atmosphere, which can be done through the real solutions that I've mentioned. These are just some of the real solutions, and I think my colleagues also in the panel will elaborate on this later.
Thank you, Claire. Panelists, does anyone else want to share your vision of Real Zero? Kwami.
Yeah, building on what Miranda said, I think it's very important to have that reducing emission at the source in mind. It means that we need to stop expanding fossil fuel projects. Because if you look at what's happening in Africa now, more projects are coming. And by the projection, by 2050, more projects are coming to Africa. So it means more emission. So why we are saying to stop emission at the source, we are saying no more oil, gas, and coal. So that's very important. So we need to divest from fossils and look at new system controlled by people, democratized, and very important. So what I want to add to what Miranda said. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwami. Simone, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with this, and let me elaborate a little bit from Global Forest Coalition's perspective on the flaws of using forests and trees as offsets. And there's three very big problems there. First, there's permanence, as you call it. Then there's leakage, and there's flawed baselines. So trees are very vulnerable, especially in a changing climate. That's the problem with permanence. And last August, for example, in Oregon and Washington State, at least 2 forests were burned to the ground that were used by BP and Microsoft as assets. So all these, so-called sequestration is now literally gone up in the air. And we've seen that with a lot of RED Plus projects as well, that massive amounts of RED Plus funding has been going to Brazil, for example, and all the forests that were saved by that are by now all up in smoke. Leakage is not a very big problem, and that means that if you try to pretend to conserve this forest, for example, from soy being cut down for soy exploration or beef production, what you very often see in countries where I spent most of my time in Paraguay is that then the production just moves to another zone. So you don't deal with the fundamental problems of these kinds of commodities. And for example, beef is a global warmer per definition because you also have the methane emissions. So just shifting it from one place to another doesn't solve that. And then last but not least, there's the flaw baselines, which is actually a very perverse one because there is some kind of assumption that deforestation would be business as usual and that every time you succeed to halt deforestation and to plant trees, that would be extra, and that you could use that extra then to offset things. But that's actually a very perverse assumption because the planet, used to be covered with trees. And if you leave land alone, in the Atlantic forest zone, for example, in Brazil, it is estimated 75% of the lands can still recover into forest if they're just left alone, if you just remove the soy and the beef. And, for example, the monoculture tree plantations, which often stand in the way of restoration. So this whole thing of this is degraded land, boom, and you can use it for everything is a very perverse assumption because degraded is just a qualification. It's more or less degraded and it can be restored. And that restoration should be business as usual and not the destruction. So I think we should really turn around this assumption that, halting deforestation is something extra. It's the normal thing, especially since 2020, because we have a Sustainable Development Goal target 15.2 that says by 2020 we should have halted deforestation. That should have been business as usual.
Thank you for those opening remarks, Simone. Gadir.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to. Glad to be talking to all of you. I just want to begin with emphasize the fact that it's a shame that we have to emphasize so many times the word real in our title. And we have to emphasize it so many times. It's because precisely as we're being sold distractions and not solutions. A solution should be just that, a solution to a problem. But instead, we're being distracted by fancy terms elaborated in some Western office, totally disconnected from the local territories and where the problems are. That's why we need to emphasize the word real all the time. And that's a concern we have because instead of emphasizing what we can do in simple ways, we just have to be dealing with very elaborated and complex schemes, you name it, like net zero, supposed nature-based solutions, RED, etc., instead of focusing on what we have to do. Just to mention that at the beginning.
Thank you, friends. Let's turn a minute and contrast that, I think, to some of the things that we're seeing on the policymaking table during this session. We have ongoing negotiations on Article 6.2 and 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, where parties continue to discuss to a minute level of detail how they're going to, mass mobilize the use of carbon markets in favor of climate action and global collaboration. Of course, the reality there, and as the latest IPCC Working Group report shows, as well as research and analysis put out for decades by everyone on this panel, as well as other climate justice groups, that carbon markets are not going to keep us below 1.5. They're not going to avoid that atlas of human suffering. Yet we're spending, years and years and hours during these 2 weeks here negotiating the technicalities of a grand scheme that we know can't work. As part of that, we're also discussing the mass deployment and scaling up of nature-based solutions, offset schemes, all of which delay action to way down the line, decades, if not longer than that. And the remarkable thing about all of that is two things. We're discussing these technicalities for pathways when we don't know how these proposals currently being put on the table are actually going to get us to real zero or below 1.5. We don't even know if they're going to work. They're complex. We're not sure how it's all going to add up. Yet we're putting in a tremendous amount of political will, billions and billions of dollars of finance to develop these risky, unproven schemes. And I think, to me, the constant contradiction that we often see play out here is we don't have to do it that way. We have these real, proven, cost-effective, community-led solutions at the ready that we know give us the best possible chance of reducing emissions to real zero, of saving communities, of keeping countries from going underwater. And yet it's just the political will, and particularly of global north countries who've contributed most to the climate crisis, who want to continue to be able to live their comfortable lifestyles, advance their fossil fuel extraction within countries. And that's the main reason that we don't have action here. We're seeing all of this now, I think, in the past couple years, be sort of united under this banner of net zero by 2050. And this has become sort of the new chant for climate action that we're hearing in the global north, led by the likes of the US, the EU, and that's really resonating within these halls. Yet there's very little about that pathway that will actually match up to the action climate science and equity shows that we need. And so I want to turn to you, Claire, now, acknowledging this dominant political agenda of net zero by 2050. What is wrong with this agenda? Can you poke some holes in this for us, help us understand the flaws, and why net zero by 2050 fails to raise the bar needed to keep us on track to keep global temperature rise to below 1.5?
Yep, so first, the whole net zero thing is not a real solution nor a real target, because there will be no attempt to stop adding to the existing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. It will heavily rely on technologies that, as Rachel Rose have mentioned, these are unproven. There are also possibilities that it will bring more harm to the planet than actually solving the climate crisis. And these technologies are believed to capture the greenhouse gas emissions that the industries will continue to produce. So there's no stopping. They will still continue to produce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Also, this net zero scheme has relied also in, as we all know, our planet has the natural carbon sinks, like as mentioned by Simone a while ago, through our soils, our forests, and these carbon sinks has the capacity to absorb carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But this capacity is limited, given the huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced since the Industrial Revolution and that we continue to produce until now. And these emissions stays in the atmosphere for centuries, for hundreds of years. Our carbon sinks can no longer do it. And relying on these, or assuming that our planet can still naturally absorb the carbon dioxide just so we can continue with business as usual or continue polluting the planet, it's nothing but a formula for disaster. Another reason why we have to challenge the whole net zero scheme is who are the ones who are advancing these? The governments of the global north and corporations who are still in denial of their climate obligations, of the actions that they have to take based on science, based on equity and fair shares, as enshrined in the Climate Convention. They are the proponents of the net zero scheme. And they are giving all their energy and developing all the machineries to mainstream net zero and make it sound like it's the ultimate solution to our climate crisis problem. Just so they can continue with business as usual, they can continue to pollute. They will not be forced to reduce or stop the excessive production and shift to renewable energy sources. They can even increase the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they are currently producing because they believe that the carbon capture technologies are there to do their job. And this is what they want us to believe right now. But what they're not telling us is that this is their way to get away with their obligations, obligations to reduce their emissions from its source based on their historical and present responsibilities. This is their way of deceiving the world so they can continue polluting the planet by forwarding technologies like carbon capture and storage and geoengineering that many experts doubt will work at the required scale to solve the climate crisis. Another false pretense of the net zero scheme is the 2050 target, which we all know is too late. It only goes to show that the net zero by 2050 message that they're trying to put out there is unambitious. The IPCC and experts have been telling us we have to act now. We have to significantly reduce our emission decades ago, but here they are proclaiming a new target 2050 with a new mechanism that barely has a scientific basis.
Thank you, Claire. A lot of what you just said and more is also captured in a report that all of the panelists here have contributed to, as well as approximately 70 other groups around the world. This report's called The Big Con. I recommend you check it out, and we can also circulate it afterwards, because it provides a really in-depth look at many of the flaws that Claire's just mentioned with this net zero by 2050 agenda, broadly, what their conceptual flaws are, and then also who's behind this agenda and the too little, too lateness of it. We look at and break down some of the major polluting corporations. We take a deeper look at their net zero climate action plans that they're parading around the world alongside their self-proclaimed climate championship, and expose some of the biggest loopholes in those plans. It's really startling, I think, looking at that, because you can just see how big of a greenwashing scheme this net zero by 2050 political agenda is becoming, and how it's serving not people, not climate action, it's not advancing real solutions, but really serving those who are continuing to pollute, who have an investment in the status quo and keeping the rich rich and the poor poor, no matter the cost to people and the planet. Frankly, no matter, even if it costs life as we know it. And the other good thing about that report, The Big Con, is that it goes a step further by looking at some of the strategies that big polluting corporations are using to actually seed this agenda. So while it looks like a very party-led political debate that's centered between governments, it's actually in many ways being manipulated and orchestrated behind the scenes by polluting corporations who are investing billions of dollars into academic and other funding initiatives to advance this as a solution, who are lobbying for policies nationally that seek to advance these false solutions instead of the truest, best version of net zero, whatever that would be if it were possible. And so this whole concept of net zero, if it ever had a scientific foundation, is now watered down to the point where it is rendered ineffective, unjust, and we need to radically rethink and shift to something that really is, again, founded on science and equity. And I think it's also worth thinking about, and Kwami, I'm going to come to you on this. In addition to all of these failings that Claire just shared, the unscientificness, for if I've just invented a word, of these schemes that we're seeing advanced by this net zero pathway. In the political debate, we also so often overlook the human cost associated with scaling up these false solutions and what the impacts of these schemes look like on the ground, particularly for the communities and ecosystems who are already the most unjustly impacted by the climate crisis. So bearing that in mind, Kwami, can you tell us a little bit about what the on-the-ground impacts are of this net zero pathway and its components like offsets and nature-based solutions?
Yeah, thank you. I think we all know that having offsets or nature-based solution narratives, those narratives lead to large-scale tree plantations. and this is happening in Africa and all over in Latin America as well. What we have been seeing is that lot of projects coming in as plantations just to sequestrate the CO2. So those commodification of nature has a very huge impact on communities in terms of monoculture tree plantations. It leads to land grabbing. It leads to communities displacement, and also the use of chemicals that pollute water, pollute rivers, and most of the impacts are hugely on women, actually, because if you look at if the communities are displaced, for instance, you see that women and children are mostly affected because they don't have, in Africa, for instance, they live with family farming, and if they are displaced, then they lose their land, and also some of the small activities, income-generated activities that helps them to take care of the children, the kids, those activities are lost. So many women are in danger. And one of the examples I want to bring here is the global, the Green Climate Fund investment in Paraguay through Albaro Fund. So the study we did shows clearly that that investment has huge impact on communities, where you see community have been displaced in a forestal area in Paraguay, and you see the tactics of Albaro Fund to divide and rule tactics, where the dispute of land is also there. Communities, the communities are being bribed. Some of them take money, and the conflict is there because the lands belong to a collectivity, or the lands belong to a group of people. And if one person among them go to get money, then it's a problem. So those are the tactics used by Albaro Fund. I think Albaro is German, no? Is it German company? Yeah. So it's very important to look at the way the companies use those investments to displace communities. And another example I want to bring here, just to let you know how the impacts also can be in future, and looking at what's happening here already in Africa, where the same displacement of communities, the same tactics, and also the way the real forests are being destroyed because they want to plant trees, or the way that afforestation becoming more dangerous for the real forests and communities. You see the pledge of African countries for the afforestation initiative. That can lead to a huge commercial plantation, because in Africa we have the study that have been done. If I can show it quickly, we see that some of the targets may become quickly a commercial tree plantation expansion, actually. And in South Africa, there is 100,000 hectares that can be used for afforestation. And in Togo, we have 600,000 hectares that can be taken. The whole Africa, actually, it's full of will be full of plantations because of that pledge that have been in born here in 2015, no, in 2017. Yeah, so those are the key impacts that I can put in. I don't forget the human rights violations, because the right to food it's no longer there, because if the right to land as well, if land is grabbed, then people will not be able to cultivate. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Kwami. Even for those of us who already know this, it's always a very startling and angering reminder of what the real impact to lives and ecosystems right here and now is, and how that links back to what's being discussed here in these negotiating rooms. It's a little bit astounding, I think it's fair to say, that while talking about all of these technicalities, not only there's a shift away from comparing it to the science and whether these technologies are proven, whether these schemes can work, but also there's not very much debate happening in these halls about the real human cost associated with these schemes. And I appreciate you bringing some of those costs to the forefront and illustrating them for us. And I think it's really fundamental that policymakers, as they continue to consider what climate action and scaling up climate ambition looks like, I think we need to ask the question, how ambitious can climate action be if it involves wide-scale human rights violations, if enrolling climate action requires the mass cutting down of forests that have the natural capacity to act as carbon sinks for the earth, to grow fast, monoculture plantations, all in the names of offsets. If carbon capture and storage and offset schemes and carbon markets involve displacing communities, indigenous peoples from their land, people who naturally look after and nurtured the earth for centuries, is this climate action? Could it ever really be considered climate action, and under what circumstance? And that's in addition, of course, to all of the other technical loopholes and scientific ones as well that Claire broke down for us. Okay, so transitioning a bit, having said that, we have talked a lot and started to sort of break down what some of the fundamental flaws are with this net zero by 2050 pathway, and why it can't be seen to be in line with climate science, with equity, or with 1.5 degree temperature threshold. Let's maybe turn to a slightly more positive portion of the side event and talk and converse with each other about what are the real solutions. What is the pathway that we need to be on, that governments need to be shifting to in order to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis and keep global temperature rise to within manageable limits, although we are already past that. So what are the real solutions that will get us to real zero, friends? What do they look like? Can you tell us as much about them as possible? And given that we are all gathered here now for these 2 weeks discussing policies that are supposed to implement climate action in the Paris Agreement, what could governments do here while in Bonn and on the road to COP27 to advance a real zero, not a fake net zero pathway? Does anyone want to kick us off with your thoughts? Go ahead, Simone.
Well, of course, we need to restore our planet. That's clear. And as I just said, if land is not used for destructive activities like tree or soy or other monocultures or unsustainable livestock farming, it can restore itself. And you've seen that, for example, here in Europe, where in the course of last century, actually a lot of forest had the chance to restore itself when the Europeans stopped using bioenergy large-scale biomass, and when they have withdrawn industrial agriculture from a lot of areas. And you see in a lot of countries how much that helped restoring the forest. So we have to free up lands and or change production in such a way that's totally harmonious. And two key solutions then, which can be implemented as of today, are first of all dietary change. You've got countries like the US where more than half of the entire landmass of the US is actually being used for meat and dairy production. If you would free up all that land and let it restore itself, including into grasslands and forests, I mean, you would really give the earth a chance to restore itself. Same thing with, of course, bioenergy. And the big cynical thing is that both industrial livestock farming and bioenergy are massively subsidized by government. In fact, there's a lot more money going into destructive activities in this world, up to 5 trillion it's estimated, than it's going into, doing the good. And as Kwami just described, even the Green Climate Fund is not always, subsidizing the good and the real solutions. They also contribute some of the very bad false solutions in this planet. I think it's clear that the Cornivia work program, could play a big role in this potentially, but that means that governments would have to start reflecting the interest of the planet instead of the economic interest of big meat and dairy in those negotiations. Same, of course, for the whole, scheme about promoting the bioeconomy and wood-based bioenergy and biofuels in general. I mean, that's all a matter of very profound corporate interests, including in the timber sector. And they are very heavily represented in these negotiating halls. In the meantime, we know the real solutions are there. Indigenous people's territories are community conserved areas and other community conservation initiatives, which are very often women-led. They have proven to work. There's more and more recognition, including very extensive scientific literature, recognizing that this is the best and the most effective and, moreover, the most equitable and gender-just way to help our planet restore itself. That very often entails agroecology, which should, of course, be on the top of the Cornivia outcomes. And for these people, business as usual, of course, they don't use that term, but is to conserve, to restore, and to work in harmony with the land. So a real solution is, first of all, respecting the territorial governance of indigenous peoples, local communities, including in particular women. But how do we get there if you see that in these halls, all the big interests of corporations are still being heavily represented? So the first thing actually that needs to be happening in Bonn is to start breaking with corporate capture. And this also means start breaking with the financial dependency on corporations, as nobody bites the hand that feeds him. And what you have seen the last decades is a very dangerous trend of more and more public institutions, including even NGOs, becoming dependent upon corporate finance. And that means that they will gradually start representing the economic interest of those corporations. And it's sad because for a lot of, institutions, public institutions, it's nowadays the only money at stake. Even the Green Climate Fund is like forcing them to accept blended finance, to accept corporate finance, forcing them into the hands of corporate interests. So we will never be able to, confront these false corporate-driven solutions, including the whole carbon offset market, which has clearly been designed for corporate interests, if we don't first and foremost stop this whole trend towards blended finance and ensure that public institutions can be independent, including universities, including scientific institutions, including United Nations institutions, which are also more and more being financed through corporate finance.
Thank you, Simone. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah,
Kwami?
I think it's very important what Simone said. I would like to emphasize on agroecology as a solution. That's very important for us. Free up land for agroecology, not monoculture plantations. Monoculture plantations never been a good action. And to add to that, I think we need to keep saying that the action should be stop emitting, to cut the emission at the source. So oil and gas should be phased out to look at a new system of energy, and that the just transition need to be discussed and in place. And very importantly, the willingness of government, both developed countries and developing countries, the willingness of government is very important. We've been saying this since. It seems like they don't want to go, even if some parameters are there. But we believe that there is a means, or there is a capacity and possibility to go for just transition. And that transition needs to be rooted in justice and to create the condition for everyone to live in dignified life. I think that's very important. That includes public service, I think both in Global South and in Global North as well, because some of the countries in Global North also facing those kind of impacts. As the climate change is affecting us all, I think we need to continue pushing for the willingness of our governments to act for a concrete and real action, where we want to see an energy system owned and controlled by a community itself. We don't want fossil fuel industries to be expanded. So those are the action the government should take. And in the NDCs, I think if they have to revise the NDCs, we need to push so that the real action that the developed countries, the Global North, should look at investment of or into the renewable energy. So that by doing that, I think we'll go from emission, we reduce the emission to save the planet. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kwami. Claire?
Yep. So, yeah, I totally agree with what Kwami and Simone have said, but I believe all these will be very difficult without climate finance. We all know that the impacts of climate crisis are not the same for everyone. The Global South suffers the most from the devastation brought by extreme weather events caused by the climate crisis. Countries like the Philippines, where I am from, can barely recover from back-to-back super typhoons that hit our country. We're hit by an average of 20 typhoons every year, and over the last decade, all these typhoons have become more destructible, causing massive loss of lives, infrastructure, and livelihood. And the Philippines, as well as many countries in the Global South, who have limited capacity to mitigate, adapt, and cover the economic and non-economic losses and damages, we have the least contribution to the climate crisis, yet we are bearing the brunt. That is why it's important to emphasize the need for climate finance, and that it is very, very crucial. It is a very, very crucial element to climate action. Without it, countries in the Global South will not be able to deliver their targets and contribute to the 1.5 goal that we all have. NDC targets must include in the equation not only emissions reductions, as Kwami has mentioned, it's important, but also climate finance. And we have to underscore that we are nearing our deadline, and it will be close to impossible to save the planet and will be very costly at that. The amount of climate finance needed will be much higher if we further delay the provision of climate finance and the implementation of climate action. And as we all know by now, as enshrined in the Climate Convention, this climate finance, I would just like to emphasize this, because in the negotiations, the Global North has their way of forgetting that climate finance is their obligation. It's not a donation, it's not an assistance, it is the obligation of those most responsible to the climate crisis, and it should be provided by the rich industrialized countries who are the same proponents of these net zero scheme to support the climate needs of those who have the least responsibility yet suffering from the most from the climate crisis. We have seen here in Bonn and as well as in previous COPs how the US and its allies are maneuvering their way away from their obligations. They're trying to avoid any talks about climate finance, from making empty promises since 2009, not delivering the 100 billion target for more than a decade, to shifting the burden to the global south and advancing net zero schemes packaged as like the holy grail and answer to all our prayers to save the planet. The civil society and developing country parties, as we have seen here in Bonn, have strongly called for the urgent delivery of climate finance, and loss and damage finance, as you all know, is very important at this point. And I think more than the net zero scheme, this should dominate the narrative of the climate talks. All the discussions, all the negotiations, all the efforts and progress that we have made in the past years will in the end be for naught without climate finance.
Thank you, Claire. Gadir, anything you want to add? Okay. Thank you, friends, for bringing up a lot of very important points. Just to highlight a couple of the things that you all shared in relation to what's currently being discussed here, and therefore what is an opportunity or a missed opportunity, depending on what action governments take over these 2 weeks. Simone, you mentioned the Cornivia work program for agriculture as a key way to advance, scale up agroecology, restore ecosystems. Claire, you also spoke to the need to scale up climate finance. There's an element of that also where governments can take the action of scaling up their nationally determined contributions and their climate action plans and make concrete commitments here and beyond Bonn to delivering their fair share, not just of climate finance, technology transfer, doing their fair share of action, which means and needs to be led by developed countries in the global north, being the largest contributors to the climate crisis, as you said, and announcing pledges or commitments to achieve real zero reductions by or before 2030 and supporting global south countries in doing the same. It's also interesting to note there's another negotiation that's happening during these 2 weeks on Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement, a rarely talked about part of the Paris Agreement in Article 6. Article 6.2 and 6.4 on market mechanisms is often what's buzzing in the halls of the UNFCCC and certainly coming out of the mouths of global north corporations and governments. But Article 6.8 is where governments have agreed to collaborate internationally using non-market approaches to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And for years, polluting wealthy nations have tried to stall progress on Article 6.8 and only talk about carbon markets. But during these 2 weeks, governments are also talking about 6.8, and they have been for years. And it's really important to see that we need to see progress advance on 6.8, the development of a work program, the elaboration of a list of real proven solutions that are not market-based that governments agree to collaborate on, including technology transfer, climate finance, shifting to just and renewable energy systems. This really needs to be a turning point if COP27 is to deliver on climate action, in addition to the things everyone else shared. This elaboration of a pathway for 6.8 to actually rapidly scale up global collaboration on non-market approaches. There's a couple of briefings which we can share with you afterwards that can elaborate what parties can be negotiating and how this can happen. One is called Real Solutions, Real Zero, how Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement can help pave the way for 1.5. There's also a really useful submission made by the Climate, Land, Ambition, and Rights Alliance that details exactly what governments could be putting forward here to advance non-market approaches and real solutions through 6.8. Also take a look at the submission from the government of Bolivia, who has been really speaking out powerfully on this as well, and aligning their position with that of people-led solutions and the people's positions and demands. Simone, I'm going to turn to you now, because you mentioned it in your intervention, and we also frequently hear that there is no climate justice without gender justice. But I'm not sure we all have a shared understanding of what that actually means and how the two relate, and how, when they're advanced together, we can achieve a much fairer, equitable, more livable world broadly. So can you explain a bit more to us what we mean by this interlinkage between gender justice and climate justice, and how gender justice helps get us to real zero?
Yeah, thank you. I think the core issues that women and other non-dominant genders continue to be politically, economically, socially and culturally marginalized all over the world. And of course we should recognize an intersectional approach to this insofar that it's discrimination based on gender, but also on race, on ethnic minorities, etc. This marginalization of these peoples means that they are disproportionately impacted by climate change. You know, you could see the videos now coming from Brazil where you have the terrible victims of the floodings, and it's the poorest houses that collapse first. You know, and very often the women are still in those houses. You can also have, Kwami actually already explained this, I mean, at the same time you also have a lot of additional impacts by false solutions on marginalized people, including in particularly women and other marginalized genders. For example, forced carbon offset schemes, you see that women tend to have far weaker land tenure rights. And if you develop these top-down solutions of biosequestration, large-scale biosequestration, using land, people's land, because land is local, per definition. For this global problem of climate change, you very much see that these top-down schemes have the tendency to marginalize the rights, role, interests of the people on the ground, and very much the people who don't have land governance rights first, and that means particularly women. And actually, together with my colleague Shaporna Lahiri, we wrote an article about that also in Climate Policy, which you're happy to review. But there also cannot be gender justice without climate justice, and I think that's very important to realize, because women are disproportionately impacted by climate change as well. So there cannot be gender justice without the real solutions that we already mentioned, like dietary change. That's a matter of gender justice as well. Halting deforestation in line with SDG 15.2 by 2020 and not by 2030, which is a corporate target. They wanted those 10 extra years. The governments had already agreed on 2020, so much for Glasgow. That is a matter of gender justice. Immediately implementing the Aichi Target 3 of the Convention on Biodiversity that said that we should have eliminated all perverse incentives, including to bioenergy and fossil fuels and unsustainable livestock production by 2020, that is a matter of gender justice. And it can happen now. You know, it doesn't even cost money. You redirect funding, or you even take it away and you can use it for more useful purposes. And also reversing the dependency of corporate capital and capitalism in general is a matter of gender justice. And I think we should really be cautious not to promote gender justice financially if that finance has actually been earned in ways that harm the climate and biodiversity. Most big money on this world has been earned through harmful activities. Calling for more capital also means calling for more capitalism, which is a patriarchal system in which women tend to be marginalized because they're less competitive, they have less capital, they have less earnings, and that means that, you know, in these global markets that keep on expanding, they continue to be more and more marginalized. Growing returns on investments and unlimited growth are inherent foundations of capitalism. That's not to blame capitalism and say it, but it's just the way the whole system works. You need to grow, you know, as a company in a capitalist system. You can't even blame that to the company. They just cannot, you know, and there's a lot of very good-willing people working for companies, but they will always have to grow, and that means that we're trespassing the planetary boundaries. And we cannot have that more than anything in the field of climate change. So we also need to reconsider our demands and maybe look for more non-capitalist real solutions. Recognizing land governance and land tenure rights and the role and traditional knowledge of women and other marginalized genders is a very good example of a non-capitalist real solution to support gender and climate justice. Dietary change, going to more healthy diets that are there for a healthy planet, that support a healthy planet, promoting local energy sovereignty as an alternative to big biomass subsidies. These are non-capitalist solutions. Redirecting all these perverse investments, all these perverse incentives into, supporting the real solutions, including taking into account common but differentiated responsibilities, especially in the South. That is, not asking for more money, but money going to the right thing, going to, supporting those who are the real victims of this whole situation. And sure, if, big corporations and big and northern countries earn a lot of money harming the climate change, there definitely is a very strong right to compensation for loss and damage in the South. We absolutely have to insist that. But we need to first and foremost also make sure that all this perverse money is being redirected. And most importantly, whenever we ask for financial support, we need to insist it is public and not dominated by corporate interests. As we all know, that this entire shift to more and more corporate finance has just been a way for the northern countries to duck their responsibilities to provide the public finance that they owe the South for the reasons of climate justice. So we really need to make sure that we focus on real solutions. Our focus should, of course, be first and foremost on preventing loss and damage, but then also on the compensation. And we, more than anything, should avoid, nature and forest becoming part of this massive capitalist scheme by preventing the financialization and commodification that Kwami already described. And these are at the heart of gender justice, really.
Thank you, Simone. And you mentioned, and I'll also say, there's this really helpful briefing that Global Forest Coalition produced at the start of SB 56 that breaks a lot of this down. I'm about to rattle off another very long title, but rest assured we'll circulate this after as well. It's called IPCC's Missing Pathways to Real Climate Solutions Towards a Gender Transformative and Rights-Based Policy Approach to Climate Modeling. Please have a look, because it really relays a lot of what you just spoke about and can be very helpful when applying it to what's on the table here at Bonn. All right, panelists, I'm going to open it up to all of you now. And to add to what Simone just shared, when we say solutions need to be people-led, community-centered, locally driven, what do we mean by this concretely? How can this be achieved, specifically here in Bonn at COP27, but also more broadly, nationally, regionally, and on other initiatives? And if the solutions that governments do advance to address the climate crisis don't have these characteristics, please also speak a little bit about what it will mean for people and the planet, as well as success at COP27. I'll start with you, Gadir.
Thank you, Rachel. Sorry. So I want to begin by perhaps rephrasing the question and saying, if solutions are not people-led, if they're not community-centered and not locally driven, then who are they led by or centered around? And then the question, my answer to that question would be that the current negotiations, you name it, the UNFCCC, the CBD and others, are clearly still not led by people's demands, but rather by specific interests, which might not be a surprise anyway in the history of our world. In the UNFCCC specifically, the role and influence of big polluters, namely the fossil fuel industry, but also other big polluter sectors like mining, is unacceptable. They look after profit and have a more than clear conflict of interest. But for decades, these sectors have spent billions of dollars simultaneously fueling and denying the climate crisis, delaying action, and pushing for what we call just very strongly it's false solutions or distractions at every level. And while raking in billions in profits each year. And despite what their greenwashing advertising says, they're still doing it, as are other major polluting industries like agribusiness. And because so much resources are put into what they call solutions, but in reality are distractions, real community-led initiatives and actions stay in the shadow in comparison. And I'm going to give an example related to the conservation sector that has totally to do with the climate change, of course. When we mention people or community, we have to talk about human rights as our system in place to protect us from abuses to our even basic rights, but also as an effective system to deal with climate change and biodiversity destruction. Fortress conservation has dominated conservation efforts led by governments and conservation organizations for many years. It is motivated by a mistaken belief that successful conservation outcomes require pristine wilderness, free from human inhabitants. Strict conservation measures may produce some conservation gains, but at the cost of evicting rural communities from their homes and ancestral lands, criminalizing their traditional livelihoods and violating their human rights. Because this is another approach that was designed somewhere far away from the territories and imposed on the lands. Estimates of the global number of conservation displaced persons stretch well into the millions. A 2017 analysis estimated that over 250,000 individuals across 15 countries were evicted from protected areas between 1990 and 2014. In addition to being morally and legally required, human rights-based conservation is the most effective, efficient, and equitable path forward to safeguarding the planet. Mounting evidence confirms that indigenous peoples and other rural rights holders possess the knowledge and ability necessary to successfully conserve and manage biodiverse ecosystems more effectively than government and a fraction of the cost. So indigenous peoples and other rural rights holders steward and claim collective rights to over half of the global land area, employing customary tenure systems anchored in traditional and contemporary knowledge to successfully manage and conserve vast ecosystems. So when these communities' impressive conservation capacities are considered alongside the extensive contribution of other marginalized rural rights holders, such as smallholder peasant farmers whose agroecological knowledge and practices provide a viable and inspiring alternative to the industrial food system, the potential power of rights-based solutions to combat the global biodiversity climate change is very clear. And this is taken from a briefing from a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd. So the evidence is more than abundant that when it's community-led, it's people's-led, it is not only more efficient, it's cost-efficient, and the results are clear there.
Thank you, Gadir. All right, now it's your turn. We have a good amount of time for some questions and discussion left. So before we hear more from our panelists, we'll turn it over to you and open up to the floor if anybody wants to pose any questions. Please put your hand up. I think we have a microphone. And if you could identify who you are as well. Thank you. I think we have one over here.
What do we as civil society organizations, we at people working at the local level, how do we challenge the government and hold them accountable? In Antigua, we have so much harm being done to our environment, yet our country accesses a lot of financing. The government is talking now about diversifying the economy, and investors are being given our protected areas, the wetlands that protect us. We are subject to storms, hurricanes. And this same government ratified the Escazú Agreement, But we as civil societies, we go out and we educate the people. And it makes me so happy when I listen to the radio. I hear the people say, you ratify the Escazú Agreement, but you don't give us no information on all these projects. There's no consultations. And the more harm they do, the more the people are becoming empowered. But we have to hold the governments accountable. We have laws. The laws are just being overridden. The ministers have the power to override the laws. And these same laws are what they use to get the financing. We have the laws in place, but at the local level, they are being broken. And I am determined to keep educating the people, to empower them, to give them the information, give them the knowledge, because the people and the environment is worth more to me than sitting. I sit on the government committees, yes, and I tell them they're wrong. But I'm not going to send my soul when the wrong decisions are taken, because they have no redress. There's no access to justice. We have destroyed so much, cut so much mangroves. Our prime minister said we can't eat mangroves. And the people suffer. As soon as the rain comes, they're flooded. And they know they need to relocate the people, but that's not in their intention. So we can't come to these meetings and continue to allow the same thing to go on. The planet is suffering. And it's not just from climate, it's from bad decision making. It's because we do not hold our governments accountable. And we have to do more. We have to wake up. We have to wake up the people. Use your mouth to advocate. Educate your people, and the people will become empowered, because people are not going to sit down and see wrong being done to the environment and they suffer. People aren't that foolish. We love to think that they're weak and vulnerable. No, people have power, and if we educate the people, the change will come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both for your question and and also for speaking truth to power in these halls. Let's take one more question back there, and then we can
Thank you very
continue.
much. My name is Titi Akusa. I work with Center for 21st Century Issues. I'm based in Lagos, Nigeria. The question I want to ask is, what's your opinion about bringing in insurance into the discussion around loss and damage? Because I know that in some African countries, they've been trying to ensure that local people are enrolled into insurance, so that when there is a climate-related or climate-induced disasters, they receive some form of payout to help them come back to what's their normal way of life. So what's our attitude towards that kind of discussion around loss and damages, knowing that we are going to be discussing loss and damage in COP27, and there's going to be a dialogue. And we also know that local people are experiencing loss and damage every day. So these are some of the issues that have been on the table, and I don't think you really touched on that. So I want us to actually, what would be your opinion? What should be our attitude towards this? Should we put loss and damage into insurance? I don't know, but I've been thinking about it, whether it makes some sense. And then looking at climate finance also, how do we also, what kind of intervention do we think can work so that local people who are experiencing the impacts of climate change get this finance as soon as they need it? Because it's so important that when disaster strikes like that, they need the kind of finance that they need to quickly get back. But we find that the climate finance doesn't work that way. It doesn't go deep down that way. So what are the kind of interventions, maybe that has worked before, or new thinking around that? Thank you.
Thank you so much to our two colleagues for your questions, as well as for sharing your wisdom and experiences as well. Let's start there. So, friends, we have two questions on the table, well, three. How do people working at the local level that challenge governments, how can they hold them accountable to their harm to the environment and communities? And then this question around loss and damage finance and whether the proposal of bringing insurance into that is a way forward, and a broader question around climate finance. How can we make climate finance work for people who are truly experiencing the impacts of climate change? Claire, I'm wondering if we should start with you, and maybe you could also just explain a little bit more about the issue of loss and damage, what's happening here with the dialogue, and then also share your thoughts on insurance and finance as well.
Yep. Thank you. Also, thank you for that question, Titi. We recognize that climate finance, the existing climate finance mechanisms that we have right now, is really inaccessible to the local communities, to the people on the ground who need it the most. And that's a problem that we have been raising in the Green Climate Fund, in the Adaptation Fund, in all these funds that we have established so far. And in the loss and damage talks here in Bonn, from Glasgow and until here in Bonn, that's one of the issues that we have been raising. That's why we want to have a separate facility for loss and damage, because loss and damage is something urgent. We cannot wait for the whole process that we have in the Green Climate Fund, where we have to accredit organizations to access the fund. You have to subject your climate projects to the approval of the board, which takes several months before you can actually access the money from the Green Climate Fund. And in the loss and damage finance facility that we have been pushing in the global north governments are trying to block, that's one element that we have to put in the loss and damage finance facility, that it should be accessible immediately to the people who need it the most, to the most vulnerable people who have been suffering from the economic and non-economic costs of loss and damage. And I'll add in a bit.
Yep, go ahead, yeah.
So on insurance, yeah, that's also another aspect in terms of pushing for loss and damage facility. These insurance mechanisms are outside of what we are discussing inside the UNFCCC. We're talking, when we speak about climate finance under the Climate Convention, we're talking about the obligations of the Global North. Setting up another mechanism or an insurance mechanism outside of the UNFCCC just gives them the pass to not acknowledge their obligation as enshrined in the Climate Convention. So if we really put all our energies to really push for this loss and damage facility that we have been pushing since Glasgow, here at Bonn, and we hope to see as an outcome in Egypt, then we no longer have to rely on these insurance mechanisms, on these other proposals that they're putting forward outside of the convention, and we can make them accountable based on the common but differentiated responsibility principle in the UNFCCC, and really make them accountable to deliver what should be given to the Global South, to the most vulnerable countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Kwami, Gadir, Simone, any other responses to those questions?
Yeah, I think to hold our government accountable, I think we need to use some tools, and you have pointed some of them out already. Popular education is one of them. So people should know what's going on the ground, and also the policies, national policies assessments. So we need to see if exactly what is there is being a benefit for people. In my country, for instance, we have in our constitution, in Article 41, saying that everyone should be safe in safe environments, or will live in safe environment. But then some policies allow some projects that destroy the environment of communities. So those are the things we need to look at and see how we can push for the policy review so that some of the projects will not harm anymore communities. And the shadow report also is one of the key tools, shadow report. So we show that what the government is doing is not in line with the policies or is not in line with some of the laws we have in the countries. But very importantly, movement building and popular education they are very key. They are very key. So maybe I want also to reflect on. I think you have talked on loss and damage and finance. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwami. Anyone else, or shall Simone go ahead?
No, just to say about the accessibility. That's a huge dilemma, and it's not just accessibility. Of course, it's very much distribution, because it can be accessible, and you've seen that a lot in for example, the Red Plus discussion, where there are indeed now a couple of funds that are directly accessible to, for example, indigenous peoples, but the overwhelming majority of funding is still going to the big actors. So you've got like very marginal money going to marginal people and big money going to big people. And that tendency to turn that around is exceptionally complicated. I mean, I did my PhD research on assumption and motivations of actors, and there's a lot of scientific research on the fact that people, even though they, claim to be idealistic and working for a common public goal like climate change, there's a subtle alignment of their strategic arguments and that they put forward and the things they strive to with their own economic interests. So the big, powerful actors will always make sure that these financial flows are mainly benefiting themselves, and then also a little bit, the real victims on the ground, and that's a worrying, tendency in all these financial mechanisms. And I'm afraid I don't have a golden solution for it, except for being very well aware that this is likely to happen with any big financial flow, including a loss and damage, where I'm definitely not an expert. But you already hear a lot about some of the resilience and adaptation funds still going to the same big actors and not to the people that really are suffering day to day from the big impacts. And I must say, having lived so long in Paraguay and seeing a lot of climate victims, I just don't see how the Ayoreo, my Ayoreo friends in Chaco, which at this moment are just without any drinking water because, the last resource has dried up. I mean, they're not getting any financial support. They would already be happy if just the right they have to public water, to public water services would be respected. They are entitled to just get normal drinking water, and whenever there's a problem with drinking water, they're the first, whose well dries up. So, if you already have those profound injustices, I mean, I must say I sometimes cannot really grasp how these kinds of schemes would work realistically on the ground. And that is why I do think it's really important that the key focus of this entire process remains on preventing global warming as much as possible. And that will, please don't fall in the trap of, let's just adapt, because it will be the big people that adapt and not the small people. And it's you see that all over the world, and the big adaptation, and this is very much inherent, these it's not even bad, it's this part of human nature that you try to subtly defend your own economic interests also, if you're on these schemes. And that's why I think a lot of more focus on real solutions and local energy sovereignty and local food sovereignty. I mean, that's important as well. I mean, it's also about, empowering local people to take care of themselves and to stand up and to really, be strong themselves and to become more resilient. Because in the end, there's so many hurdles to really get, this big finance into the little people.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions or comments from the audience? One here. Thank you, Helen. I know, I'll just get a couple more questions and then we'll...
I was just going to read a question. Hi, my name's Rhiannon, and I'm from the Green Economics Institute, but I'm also a geography student, currently studying at undergraduate level. And I really appreciate the talk today. It was really, actually quite positive, because we've just come from a session which was really negative. So it's really uplifting to have something positive going on here. And I was really interested in your discussion about human rights, and I wanted to ask about how do you propose on a local level for young people to be aware of their rights when facing climate-based human rights violations and challenge those rights violations?
Thank you. I think we have one question here as well. Oh, yeah, one. Let's take 1, 2, and then one.
Hi, Ben from UK Youth Climate Coalition. So yeah, I really enjoyed listening particularly to the solutions that you outlined, like talking about agroecology, land rights, eliminating perverse incentives, recognising local and indigenous knowledge. I guess my question is about how we link those with finance, and not just government finance, but what the role of the larger amount of money in private finance, which, as you talked about a lot, is going in the wrong direction at the moment. So how do we take that money that my parents or my grandparents have locked away in their pension funds and push it towards the solutions to solve deforestation and these other crises that we talked about? And that's me.
Thank you. Let's take one more here, and then we'll take a pause while we hear from our panelists.
Hi, this is Duncan Pruitt from Oxfam. Thanks for really great interventions. I attended, there was an event by the Climate Champions on non-state actors and the global stocktake earlier this week. And in that, Nigel Topping talked a lot about, well, first of all, he referred to the fact that there was a report coming out which would expose that like 65% of company commitments to net zero were being proven to be not robust, probably more than 65%. But he was also really saying that it's a priority of theirs to expose greenwashing. I thought that was quite interesting, given that they seem to be involved in an initiative which is really, beating the corporate drum at the same time. So I was wondering whether it's an interesting strategy to use the global stocktake to try to expose some of the challenges that the panelists have been mentioning.
Thank you. We'll pause there. Hopefully we'll have time for one more round of questions in a moment. So panelists, we have a couple more questions on the table. How do you propose on a local level for young people to be aware of their rights? How do we link solutions with finance more broadly? And this question around company commitments to net zero, exposing greenwashing, and how we can use GST or other mechanisms to navigate and address some of the challenges you all raised. Gadir, let's start with you in case you want to respond to any of the earlier questions as well. I'll just note, panelists, we're coming up on our last 8 minutes, so try to stick to the most important things in the hopes that we can get one more round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, the UN multilateral system, the environmental multilateral system, has failed to make countries accountable. So that's why we can have, for example, in the CBD, after 10 years of a set of targets, countries can come and tell us, sorry, we didn't do it. Just as simple as that. So there is no accountability. Just like there is no accountability in the UNFCCC. After so many years of negotiations, countries can still come and tell us, sorry, we might not achieve the target. We cannot let that happen anymore. I mean, we have to denounce that. Denounce it outside and make sure that within the UN system that changes, that there are accountability mechanisms that make there to be some sort of sanction. You cannot just say, sorry, I messed up the world. Let's try to find another 10 years of negotiations to find another solution. But we do have, in the multilateral system and in these spaces, we do have, there are tools. The Escazú agreement that was mentioned as a regional Latin American tool that is the first agreement legally binding that recognizes environmental defenders, for example. But one thing is to approve it at that level, and one of the different things is that communities and young people empower it. Then we here maybe have the role, privileged people who have the privilege to be here, have the role to breach that, to make sure that these messages are connected, for example. That's not the only example. And there are examples in the UN multilateral system. CITES, for example, does have some accountability mechanisms that can be applied. The human rights, if we connect these systems with the human rights whole system, then we expect that in some years from now, destroying nature should be as incredible, as outraging as the violation of the rights of children and indigenous peoples all over the world. For the time being, it's just a right we have to extract and destroy everything we can. That has to change the narrative. Just that for the time.
Thank you, Gadir. Does anyone else want to comment? Claire.
I'll probably comment on the question about finance. So just quickly, the problem with using private source for climate action of finance is that it is currently being advanced by the global north to evade from their obligations again. I mean, okay, we don't have money to put into to climate finance. We don't have enough money to deliver our climate finance obligations. Here comes the private sector, chip in and put your money in the pot of climate finance. And we know that's dangerous because private sector have their own agenda. It's probably going to be profit-oriented. This will probably be will incur more debt burden to the global south, and we know that's a dangerous formula also to mobilize climate finance. Yeah, that's probably the quickest answer to your question.
I actually, just to add to that, because I actually think you also mentioned pension funds. And this is a very important issue that I definitely don't want to get lost in this conversation, because you're very right. The pension funds are massive. And of course, that's, money gathered by people, and it's super cynical that so many pension funds are still investing in fossil fuels, in bioenergy, in industrial livestock farming and other, very harmful activities that are destroying the future of their own, pension holders. I mean, that's absurd. And happily, there have been some successes. Like in Norway, they've convinced the pension scheme, the biggest one, not to invest in palm oil anymore. In the Netherlands, we just had an agreement that one of the biggest pension schemes, partly of government officials, would no longer invest would divest from fossil fuels. That it's too slow, though. And one of the key things about these perverse investments, the need to divest from harm, is to have more strict regulation. I mean, it's actually absurd that a pension scheme is allowed to invest in fossil fuels. Of course, to get that legislation, you then need governments that are free from corporate interest. Like in the Netherlands, it was indeed necessary for the pension scheme to take the initiative because the current government is so much dominated by corporate interests that they wouldn't take the lead in this. And I've even heard that in the US, it's now getting the other way around, that in some of the Republican states, the legislators are prohibiting the pension funds to divest from fossil fuels. And some West Virginia senator, I believe, or governor actually said, well, we are making money out of fossil fuels, so we can't allow our pension scheme not to invest in fossil fuels. It was as simple as that. Talking about corporate interests being invested in government legislation. But anyhow, and then I'll promise not to speak again and during my 1 minute. But I wanted to say this, just to say because it's very much linked. We always. I would caution people not to look only for solutions within this process, within this building, and at COP27. And of course there's a lot of solutions on the ground, as my good friend Ruud already mentioned. But I mean, the big thing is also that there's other processes that are less corporate dominated than this one. And because of the Green Climate Fund and the big funding now being so corporate dominated, I'm afraid that for a lot of real solutions, including, for example, agroecology, this might not be the place where we will get it. While it's already there partly in, for example, the Convention on Biodiversity. And a lot of other fora are making progress. So please don't only think we need this solution, so it needs to be here. Sometimes, trying to push that solution in another form can be a lot more effective.
Thank you, Simone. I'm afraid we're out of time, so we'll have to end it here in just a moment. Before I hand over to our panelists to say any last remarks, want to thank all of you for spending your time being here, also for being part of the fight. if you're an organization who's interested in being part of the global campaign to demand climate justice, please speak to Gadir, who can give you the rundown of how to do that. And I think we all look forward to and welcome continued conversation amongst each other as well. So feel free to grab us in the halls or tap us on the shoulder. I want to just highlight one thing that our comrade here said when they described this as a positive and uplifting event, which I really appreciate, and I think many of us do, because the reality is the fight for climate justice and centering that in climate action is a very difficult one. And those of us who call out extractivism, corporate capture, what's wrong with the solutions on the table are often seen as the pessimists. But I think the reality is what's at the heart of the climate justice movement and the women and the indigenous peoples and communities who lead that fight is that we are optimists. We believe in a better world. And even more than that, these communities, these people, including those you see up here and many others, have the solutions at the ready to lead to that world. So I just wanted to appreciate what you said and also kind of end on that note. With that, panelists, just very quick couple sentences of last remarks if you'd like, and then I'm afraid we have to clear the room. But look forward to what will be continued conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Oops. Thank you very much, Rachel, for this. I also appreciate this conversation. I think what we need to know is we need to keep on fighting. We can't give up because people are not thinking right. We need to do right thing because those solutions are already on the ground. So we need to show them. We need to promote those solutions so they know what we are talking about. That's very important. And in terms of how, I think to respond to human rights, some people don't know their rights. Even if they do, they don't know how to defend it. So I think continuously we need to dialogue, we need to train, and also bring people to identify those rights that are violated by climate change. From there, you can build the trust. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kwami. Gadir, any last short remarks?
Just thank you very much for staying, for listening. Spread the words. Just ask any questions you consider appropriate. And people's power, climate justice. Thanks.
Thank you. Claire?
Yep. So I just want to tell everyone we shouldn't buy the net zero by 2050 goal. We may have less time. I mean, the urgency is there, but relying on these unproven technologies, these schemes that were advanced by the global north and the corporations, without real action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transform our systems is more dangerous. So I urge everyone to talk to our governments. I'm sure, like my government, they have been victims of misinformation that the net zero scheme is the ultimate solution, but it's not. It's the people-led solutions that's really going to save the planet. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Simone, Claire, Gadir, and Kwami. People power, climate justice.